Hello and welcome to part 9 of the Azure Administrator Exam Practice Question Series on Tech with Jaspal. In this part of the series, we are going to cover some of the very important networking concepts. Mainly the questions are focused on Azure Bastion, Azure ExpressRoute, Azure DNS, and Azure Virtual Network. So if you are someone who is struggling with Azure networking concepts, then this is the right video for you. We will also touch base questions on other topics that include Azure File Share, Azure RBAC, and Azure Monitor Network Insights and Recovery Services Vaults as well. So this video is a full package to kickstart your Azure Administrator journey. Let's now start with first question of this part of the series. Friends, this is question number 173 of the series. You have an Azure subscription that contains the virtual networks shown in the following table. Now you have two virtual networks with the name of VNet1 and VNet2. Both are hosted in East US location, and VNet1 is paired with VNet2 and VNet2 is paired with VNet1. Each virtual network has 50 connected virtual machines. You need to implement Azure Bastion. The solution must meet the following requirements. And your requirements are support host scaling, support uploading and downloading files, support the virtual machines on both VNet1 and VNet2, minimize the number of addresses on the Azure Bastion subnet. How should you configure Azure Bastion? And the first part is regarding subnet size. And your options are subnet mask of 24, 26, 28, and 29. And folks, the correct answer here is subnet mask with 26. Let's head to Microsoft documentation to understand the factors that led to choosing 26 subnet mask as the correct answer. So folks, whenever you deploy Azure Bastion using any SKU except the developer SKU, Bastion requires a dedicated subnet named Azure Bastion subnet. You must create this subnet in the same virtual network that you want to deploy Azure Bastion to. This subnet must have the following configuration. Now, take a note of these configuration, as these are the ones that are going to help you in answering this question. The subnet name must be Azure Bastion subnet. Subnet size must be 26 mask or larger. And when we say larger, it is in terms of wordings, it goes down, which is 25, 24, etc. For host scaling, a subnet of 26 mask or larger subnet is recommended. Using a smaller subnet space limits the number of scale units. The subnet must be in the same virtual network and resource group as the Bastion host. The subnet cannot contain other resources. So folks, based on these 5 requirements that have been listed here, you can automatically rule out subnet mask 28 and 29. Now you are left with only 2 options, which is subnet mask 24 and subnet mask 26. And if you noticed in the requirements in the question, it said minimize the number of addresses on the Azure Bastion subnet. So for that very reason, we will eliminate 24 subnet mask and choose 26 subnet mask as the correct answer, because 26 subnet mask will have less IPs as compared to 24 subnet mask. Now the next part of the question is regarding public IP, and your options are basic SKU with dynamic allocation, basic SKU with static allocation, and standard SKU with static allocation. And the correct answer here would be standard SKU with static allocation. Again, let's head to documentation to read more about public IP with Azure Bastion. Now, as you can see in the public IP addresses section, Azure Bastion deployments require a public IP address except developer SKU deployments. The public IP must have the following configuration. The public IP address SKU must be standard. That's the first part of all the options. Then the public IP address assignment allocation method must be static. The public IP address name is the resource name by which you want to refer to this public IP address. You can choose to use a public IP address that you already created as long as it meets the criteria required by Azure Bastion and isn't already in use. So folks, even though we have gone through all the four configurations, but the answer just lies in the first two configuration. The public IP address SKU must be standard and public IP address allocation method must be static. If we combine these two options, then you get the right choice in this case, which was the third option, standard SKU with static allocation. I hope you now understand why I have chosen standard SKU with static allocation as the correct answer. But if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comments section. This is question number 174. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines that will run Windows Server 2019 in a virtual machine scale set by using an Azure Resource Manager template. You need to ensure that Nginx is available on all the virtual machines after they are deployed. What should you use? Your options are the publish-AG-VM DSC configuration commandlet, Azure Application Insights, Azure Custom Script Extension, the new-AZ configuration assignment commandlet. And folks, the correct answer here is Azure Custom Script Extension. The custom script extension downloads and runs scripts on Azure virtual machines. Use this extension for post-deployment configuration, software installation, or any other configuration or management task. So we are specifically concerned about software installation, and in our case, it's Nginx. You can download scripts from Azure Storage or GitHub to provide them to the Azure portal at extension runtime. The custom script extension integrates with Azure Resource Manager template, which is one of the requirements in this question. You can also run it by using the Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, the Azure PowerShell portal, or Azure Virtual Machines REST API. You have an Azure subscription that contains a recovery services vault named Vault 1. You need to enable multi-user authorization MAU for Vault 1. Which resource should you create first? Your options are an administrative unit, a managed identity, a resource guard, a custom Azure role. Folks, let's first understand what is multi-user authorization for recovery services vault. So this is one of the official pages from Microsoft, which is talking about multi-user authorization in Azure Backup. Multi-user authorization for Azure Backup allows you to add an additional layer of protection to critical operations on your recovery services vaults and backup vaults. For MUA, Azure Backup uses another Azure resource called the Resource Guard to ensure critical operations are performed only with applicable authorization. So for that very reason, we will choose option C, a Resource Guard, as the correct choice in this case. So folks, before we proceed forward, I would like to remind you that we have now reached 175 questions in this series. If you are looking to gain PDF access to all these questions, then do not forget to join the channel at Gold membership tier. Once you have joined the channel, just email me at devopshub2023@gmail.com, which is also available on your screen now, and gain access to the PDF. Let's look at question number 176. You have an on-premise data center and an Azure subscription. You plan to connect the data center to Azure by using ExpressRoute. You need to deploy an ExpressRoute gateway. The solution must meet the following requirements. Your options are support up to 10 Gbps of traffic, support availability zones, support fast path, minimize costs. Which SKU should you deploy? Your options are ERGW1AZ, ERGW2, ERGW3, and ERGW3AZ. Folks, this is unfortunately one of those questions where you have to memorize things, as no logic applies to such questions. Let's scroll through Microsoft documentation and see which one is best suited for the given requirement. The ExpressRoute virtual network gateways can use the following SKUs: ERGW scale, which is in preview, standard, high performance, ultra performance, ERGW1AZ, ERGW2AZ, and ERGW3AZ. So folks, based on this, you can say that out of the 4 options, option B and option C are not even valid options. So we can automatically rule out option B and C. Now we are left with option A, which is ERGW1AZ and ERGW3AZ, which is option D. Let's scroll through this page more and read about different requirements that are shown here. Now, one of the requirement is it should support fast path. Now, let's read through this table. The following table shows the features supported across each gateway type. If you are using ERGW1AZ, and if you can see fast path is not supported, so you can again, this will help you in eliminating one more option. So you can eliminate option A. And now we are just left with option D, which is ERGW3AZ, and that supports fast path. Even though we have eliminated all the options and we now know what is the correct answer, which is option D, but let's scroll through this page and read about different other requirements that we need to specify. Now, one of the requirement is support up to 10 Gbps of traffic. And here again, you can see ERGW1AZ just supports up to 1 Gbps. Then ERGW2AZ, which is not even in our options, supports up to 2 Gbps. And ERGW3AZ supports up to 10 Gbps. So this is again one more indication that option D is the correct choice in our case. So folks, this is question number 177. You have an Azure subscription that contains a resource group named RG1. You plan to create an Azure Resource Manager template to deploy a new virtual machine named VM1. VM1 must support the capture of performance data. You need to specify resource dependencies for the ARM template. In which order should you deploy the resources? To answer, move all the resources from the list of resources to the answer area and arrange them in the correct order. So basically, you just need to tell in which order you need to specify resource dependencies. And resources are virtual machine, Azure monitor extension, network interface, and virtual network. So folks, you just not need to create the VM here, but you also need, your VM also needs to support the capture of performance data. That is the reason in the resources you have Azure mention about Azure monitor extension as well. So take that into consideration. And the correct answers are now on your screen. First 2 steps should be crystal clear to you. If you watched the previous part, you first need to create the virtual network, followed by network interface, and then you create the virtual machine. Finally, you will install Azure Monitor extension to support capturing the performance data. This order ensures that the necessary network and interface components are created before the virtual machine, and the extension is installed after the VM is created to support capturing the performance data. So folks, before we proceed forward, if you are liking the content, then do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe the channel, as this helps the video reach a wider audience. Now let's look at question number 178. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to migrate 50 virtual machines from VMware vSphere to the subscription. You create a recovery services vault. What should you do next? Your options are configure an extended network, create a recovery plan, deploy an open virtualization application OVA template to vSphere, configure a virtual network. Friends, I feel this is a very poorly worded question, as looking at the options, it seems to be related to preparing for disaster recovery to Azure. However, question uses the word migrate to Azure, for which you have a specific tool called Azure Migrate. I'll go with an assumption that this is part of disaster recovery setup, just because the question says they have created a recovery services vault, which we don't need while working with Azure VM Migrate. So here we are in the documentation to prepare Azure for on-premise disaster recovery to Azure. As you can see, the first step here is create a recovery services vault, which is not even needed when you are using Azure Migrate. That is the reason I'm following this documentation, and based on this, I'll be choosing the correct choice. So the first step is to create a recovery services vault, and then you set up an Azure network. Now, as part of setting up the Azure network, you need to create a virtual network, which is one of the options. And that is the reason we will choose create or probably configure a virtual network as the correct choice. So folks, if we go with Azure Migrate as the base to answer this question, then the answer would be option C, deploy an open virtualization application OVA template to vSphere. But that doesn't need recovery services vault. So I have gone with an assumption that they are talking about disaster recovery while using migrate as a word, which is not fit for this question. Let's look at question number 179. You have an Azure subscription that contains the virtual networks shown in the following table. All the virtual networks are peered. Each virtual network contains 9 virtual machines. You need to configure secure RDP connections to the virtual machines by using Azure Bastion. What is the minimum number of Bastion hosts required? And your options are 1, 3, 9, and 10. Now you have 10 virtual networks, and they are using 3 locations. Basically, first 3 virtual networks are in US East, and then the next 3 virtual networks are in UK South, and then the last 4 virtual networks are in Asia East. So we need to tell how many or what is the minimum number of Bastion hosts required. And folks, the correct answer here is you just need 1 Bastion host. Let's go through the Bastion host documentation to understand this more. Azure Bastion and VNet peering can be used together. When VNet peering is configured, you don't have to deploy Azure Bastion in each peered VNet. This is one of the key things that I have taken into consideration while choosing that the minimum number of Bastion host is 1, because the question said irrespective of whether they have whatever number of virtual networks, they are peered with each other. So that is why you just need 1 Azure Bastion host. This means, now let's read through. This means if you have an Azure Bastion host configured in 1 virtual network, it can be used to connect VMs deployed in peered VNets without deploying an additional Bastion host. Now, Azure Bastion works with the following type of peering: virtual network peering and global virtual network peering. Which virtual network peering is connect virtual networks within the same Azure region, and global network peering is connecting virtual networks across Azure regions. So even though all the virtual networks are segregated across different regions, but since Azure Bastion supports global virtual network peering, that doesn't really matter in our case, and we can still choose 1 Bastion host as the correct answer. If the requirements were tweaked a bit, let's say the virtual networks were not peered, or there was some new criteria added in the requirement, then the correct choice will definitely change. So it is, again, as I always say, it is very important you pay attention to these small keywords mentioned in the question. There are many distractors as well, but there are few keywords that help you eliminate the incorrect choices. This is question number 180 of the series. You have an Azure subscription that contains 10 network security groups, 10 virtual machines, and a log analytics workspace named Workspace 1. Each NSG is connected to a virtual machine. You need to configure an Azure Monitor Network Insights alert that will be triggered when suspicious network traffic is detected. What should you do first? Your options are deploy connection monitor, configure data collection endpoints, configure a private link, configure NSG flow logs. And friends, the correct answer here is configure NSG flow logs. Let's understand NSG flow logs in more detail. Network Security Group's flow logging is a feature of Azure Network Watcher that allows you to log information about IP traffic flowing through a network security group. Flow data is sent to Azure storage from where you can access it and export it to any visualization tool, security information and event management solution, which is CM solution, or intrusion detection system IDS of your choice. Why you should use flow logs? It's vital to monitor, manage, and know your own network so that you can protect and optimize it. You need to know the current state of the network, who's connecting, and where users are connecting from. It gives you a lot of information about your network. You also need to know which ports are open to the internet, what network behavior is expected, and what network behavior is irregular, and when sudden rises in traffic happen. So you get a lot of monitoring to understand what is happening at your network level. Now, flow logs are the source of truth for all network activity in your cloud environment. Whether you are in a startup that's trying to optimize resources or a large enterprise that's trying to detect intrusion, flow logs can help. You can use them for optimizing network flows, monitoring throughput, verifying compliance, detecting intrusions, and more. Let's look at some of the common use cases. The first one are from network monitoring perspective. You identify unknown or undesired traffic. You monitor traffic levels and bandwidth consumption. You filter flow logs by IP and port to understand application behavior. And you can export flow logs to analytics and visualization tools of your choice to set up monitoring dashboard. This is what we are doing in this question, where we are using the log analytics workspace named workspace 1. Now let's look at the common use cases from monitoring and optimization perspective. You identify top talkers in your network. You combine with geo IP data to identify cross-region traffic. You understand traffic growth for capacity forecasting. You use data to remove overly restrictive traffic rules. And then from compliance perspective, use flow data to verify network isolation and compliance with enterprise access rules. And from network forensics and security analysis perspective, you can analyze network flows from compromised IPs and network interfaces. You can export flow logs to any SIEM or IDS tool of your choice. That is what we read when we were reading the introduction of NSG flow logs. Question number 181. You have an Azure subscription that contains the virtual networks shown in the following table. You have 3 virtual networks named VNet 1, VNet 2, and VNet 3. The location of VNet 1 and VNet 2 is East US, and VNet 3 is hosted in West US. VNet 1 is paired with VNet 2, VNet 2 is paired with VNet 1 and VNet 3, VNet 3 is paired with VNet 2. The subscription contains the virtual machines shown in the following table. You have 3 virtual machines named VM1, VM2, and VM3. VM1 and VM3 are using Windows operating system, and VM2 is Linux based. VM1 is connected to VNet 1, VM2 is connected to VNet 2, and VM3 is connected to VNet 3. Each virtual machine contains only a private IP address. You create an Azure Bastion for VNet 1 as shown in the exhibit on the right hand side of your screen. Basically, the name of the Bastion is Bastion 1, region is East US, tier is basic, instance count is 2, virtual network is VNet 1, and it is using a subnet named Azure Bastion subnet with a subnet mask of 24. Public IP address does not exist but is being created, and the name of the public IP address is VNet1-IP. And the SKU for public IP is standard and assignment is static. Now, based on this exhibit, you need to tell whether the statements that are going to be shown now are right or wrong. And the first statement is the remote desktop client mstsc.exe can be used to connect VM1 through Bastion 1. MSTSC is Windows native client. So let's read through the requirement of using Bastion with native client. So folks, when you deploy the Bastion, you need to specify the following settings. On the basics tab for instance details tier, select standard. You need to select standard tier. Native client support requires the standard SKU. Before you create the Bastion host, go to Advanced tab and check the box for native client support along with checkboxes for any other features that you want to deploy. Then you just review and validate, and then you create your Bastion host. So friends, you saw that standard SKU is needed to use the Windows native client, but here in our exhibit, you can see the basic SKU has been selected. That is why this statement is incorrect. The remote desktop client cannot be used to connect to VM1 through Bastion 1. Let's look at next statement. The Azure portal can use SSH to connect to VM2 through Bastion 1. Bastion is deployed in VNet 1, as you can see in the exhibit, and VNet 1 is paired with VNet 2 where VM2 is deployed. So VM2 will be accessible using Bastion, and this statement is correct. Let's look at third statement. The Azure portal can use SSH to connect to VM3 through Bastion 1. This statement is exactly same as that of statement 2. The only difference is earlier we were talking about VM2 and now we are talking about VM3. VM3 is deployed in VNet 3, which has no peering defined with VNet 1 where Bastion is deployed. So VM3 won't be accessible using Bastion. Therefore, this statement is incorrect. Let's look at SKU and Bastion details, as there are more reasons to confirm correct answers of statement 2 and 3 than just the ones that I just mentioned. So folks, this is the article on Microsoft website, which is talking about different SKUs and what you can do when you are using certain SKU of the Bastion. So there are basically 3 SKUs: developer, basic, and standard. Now the features are defined on the left hand side of the table. You can connect to target VMs in same virtual network. So you can see whether you are using any of the SKU, you can do this and achieve this functionality. However, the main feature that you have to take into consideration for the scope of our question is, you would have noticed that VM1 and VM3 were Windows based and VM2 was Linux based. So this hosting OS was also influencing the answer that I have chosen. Let's read through that. Connect to Windows VM using RDP and connect to Windows VM using SSH. You can see if you are using developer SKU, then you can connect to Windows VM using RDP, but you cannot connect to Windows VM using SSH. Similarly, if you want to use SSH, then you even can't do it with basic SKU, which we were using. So VM3 was a basic SKU Windows VM. That's why it was also not accessible. So that is one more option to rule out and conclude that statement 3 was an incorrect choice. Similarly, if you are using a Linux VM and you want to connect to it using SSH, or you want to connect using RDP, so with SSH, you get support in all the 3 SKUs, whether it is developer, whether it is basic, or it is standard. So this was also one of the factor that played a key role, even if, for example, even if the peering was there, but for instance, it was a Windows VM, so you wouldn't have been able to connect to it using SSH because the basic SKU didn't support it. But here, the basic SKU supports connecting to Linux VM using SSH. That's why the first factor was to ensure the connectivity is there. The second factor was to ensure that the SKU also supports it. Whereas if you are talking about connecting to a Linux VM using RDP, you can see even basic SKU doesn't support it. So for that, you need to have a standard SKU. So friends, I hope now you understand why all the 3 statements were chosen correct or incorrect. If you still have any doubts, please post them in the comments section. If you are enjoying the content, friends, please hit the like button and subscribe the channel. Remember, if you would like to get access to the full set of questions in PDF format for quick revisions and offline study, then you can gain access to it by joining the channel as a gold member. And then you just need to email me at devopshub2023@gmail.com requesting your PDF copy. Let's now get back to the questions. This is question number 182. You have an Azure subscription. You plan to use an Azure Resource Manager template to deploy a virtual network named VNet1 that will use Azure Bastion. How should you complete the template? Now, on the right hand side of your screen, you have a snippet from a template where you can see two question marks in red. You basically need to tell what would be the name of the subnet and what would be the address prefix of the subnet that you are going to use for Azure Bastion. To answer this question, you need to know what are the configurations that you need to select when you are creating a Azure Bastion subnet. So the first one is in the name you have four options, and the options are Azure Bastion subnet, Azure Firewall subnet, LAN 01, remote access subnet. And friends, the correct answer here is first option, which is Azure Bastion subnet. We'll read through the documentation in a while to understand this in more detail, but first, let's look at the address prefix things as well. And in the address prefix, you have four options, which is 10.10.0/26, which is basically the subnet mask 26, subnet mask 27, subnet mask 29, and subnet mask 30. And the correct answer, friends, here is with the subnet mask 26. Now let's head to Microsoft documentation to understand this in more detail, so that if there is any variation of this question in exam, then you also know what you need to choose in that case. So friends, when you deploy Azure Bastion using any SKU except the developer SKU, Bastion requires a dedicated subnet named Azure Bastion subnet. This is what answers the first part of the question. You must create this subnet in the same virtual network that you want to deploy Azure Bastion to. The subnet must have the following configuration. Subnet name must be Azure Bastion subnet, which is what we know. Subnet size must be mask 26 or larger, which is 25, 24, and so on, which is what answers the second part of your question. The subnet masks which were given in the question were 26, 27, 29, and 30, and the largest was 26. And folks, before I go ahead with the other parts of these requirements or configurations, let's read through this important section. For Azure Bastion resource deployed on or after November 2021, the minimum Azure Bastion subnet size is subnet mask 26 or larger. All Azure Bastion resources deployed in subnet of size 27 subnet mask prior to this date are unaffected by this change and will continue to work. But we highly recommend increasing the size of an existing Azure Bastion subnet to subnet mask 26 in case you choose to take advantage of host scaling in the future. So if you don't really need to use host scaling, you can still use a subnet mask of 27, but it is highly recommended you use 26 or a larger subnet. The subnet must be in the same virtual network and resource group as the Bastion host. The subnet cannot contain other resources. So these are two other configurations that I wanted to you to be across, as these can also play a critical role in answering these type of questions. Question number 183. You have an Azure subscription that contains a resource group named RG1 and a virtual network named VNet1. You plan to create an Azure container instance named container1. You need to be able to configure DNS name label scope reuse for container1. What should you configure for container1? And your options are the private networking type, the public networking type, a new subnet on VNet1, a confidential SKU. You can set the DNS name reuse policy on the networking tab during the container instance creation process using the DNS name label scope reuse field, and it's only available after choosing public networking type, which is option B. Public networking type allows you to assign a DNS name label to the container instance that is globally unique within Azure, and it's accessible from the internet. This is typically used when you want to expose a service hosted in a container to the public. So folks, I am now in the create container instance wizard in the Azure portal just to show you where those settings show. I am currently in the networking tab, and in the networking type, there are basically three options available: public, private, and none. If you can see, when the public option is selected, you get the option as DNS name label scope reuse. And the option that is selected is any reuse unsecure. Let's type the name so that this becomes available. For example, let's type something, and if in this now you can see DNS name label scope reuse is not grayed out now, and you can choose from the available options. The options are tenant, subscription, resource group, no reuse, any reuse. Any reuse was selected by default, and it is an unsecure option. And let's read through the definition of it. A deterministic hash of your selected customer specific data will be auto-generated and added as a DNS name label to your container instance FQDN, which is fully qualified domain name. This hash prevents malicious subdomains takeover and ensures that the FQDN can only be reused within the selected scope. Now, if I change the networking type, you can see this option goes away. It is not available if you choose networking type as private, and it is also not available when you choose networking type as none. So friends, I hope you now understand why public networking type has been chosen as the correct answer in this case. Question number 184. You have an Azure subscription that contains a virtual network named VNet1. VNet1 uses two ExpressRoute circuits that connect to two separate on-premise data centers. You need to create a dashboard to display detailed metrics and a visual representation of the network topology. What should you use? And your options are Azure Monitor Network Insights, a data collection rule also called as DCR, an Azure Virtual Network Watcher, Log Analytics. And friends, the most appropriate choice for this case would be option A, Azure Monitor Network Insights. Azure Monitor Network Insights provide a comprehensive and visual representation through topology, health, and metrics of all deployed network resources without requiring any configuration. It also provides access to network monitoring capabilities like connection monitor, NSG flow logs, and traffic analytics. Additionally, it provides other network diagnostic features as well. Folks, let's now find out if ExpressRoute is a supported resource, as that's the critical resource in the network topology in question. So as you can see now, I am in the availability of resources sections. By default, all networking resources are visible in Azure Monitor Network Insights. You can select the resource type for viewing resource health and metrics. Subscription details, location, a subset of networking resources has been onboarded. For onboarded resources, you have access to a resource specific topology view and a built-in metrics workbook. These out-of-box experiences make it easier to explore resource metrics and troubleshoot issues. Resources that have been pre-onboarded are Application Gateway, Azure Bastion, Azure Firewall, Azure Front Door. There are many: Azure NAT Gateway, ExpressRoute, which is what is the center of answering our question, Load Balancer, Local Network Gateway, and so on. You can read through this list. So basically what you know now is, even if the question was talking about something else other than the express routes, then still the answer remains same if it is from one of the resources mentioned in this list. This is question number 185 of the series, friends. You have a Microsoft Entra tenant that has the contoso.onmicrosoft.com domain name. You have a domain name of contoso.com registered at a third-party registrar. You need to ensure that you can create Entra ID users that have names containing a suffix of @contoso.com. Which three actions should you perform in sequence? To answer, move the appropriate actions from the list of actions to the answer area and arrange them in correct order. So folks, you need to choose three actions and you need to put them in the correct order. Now the actions given are: add a record to the public contoso.com DNS zone, add an Azure AD tenant, configure company branding, create an Azure DNS zone, add a custom name, verify the domain. And the first step here is to add a custom domain name to Azure AD. When we add a custom domain name, Azure AD gives us the information we need to create DNS records at the domain name registrar. And the next step would be to add a record to the public contoso.com DNS zone. You need to add a DNS record to your domain name registrar to verify that you own the domain. This record is typically a TXT or MX record for domain verification. Finally, you verify the domain in Azure portal. Entra ID checks if the DNS record exists, and if it does, the domain is verified. Question number 186. You have a registered DNS domain name contoso.com. You create a public Azure DNS zone named contoso.com. You need to ensure that records created in the contoso.com zone are resolvable from the internet. What should you do? Your options are create NS records in contoso.com, modify the SOA record in the DNS domain registrar, create the SOA record in contoso.com, modify the NS records in the DNS domain registrar. To ensure that records created in the contoso.com zone are resolvable from the internet, you need to modify the NS, which is name server record in the DNS domain registrar. When you create a public Azure DNS zone named contoso.com, Azure assigns a set of NS records for that zone. These NS records specify the name servers responsible for handling DNS queries for contoso.com domain. To make the records in the Azure DNS zone resolvable from the internet, you need to update the NS records at the DNS domain registrar to point to the name servers provided by Azure. Let's look at question number 187, folks. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account named Storage 1. The subscription is linked to an Entra ID tenant named contoso.com that syncs to an on-premise Active Directory domain. The domain contains the security principles shown in the following table. Now you have a user with the name of user1 and you have a computer with the name of computer1. In Entra ID, you create a user named user2. The Storage 1 account contains a file share named share1 and has the following configurations. Its kind is storage v2, and in the properties you can see Azure file identity based authentication has been chosen, and in the directory service option AD is chosen. When they mention AD, it is on-premise Active Directory. And the properties mentioned of the Active Directory are domain name, NetBIOS domain name, and forest name. All are contoso.com. Folks, let's first look at Azure Files identity-based authentication so we have a better idea while answering the upcoming questions. So Azure File supports identity-based authentication over SMB through the following methods. You can only use one method per storage account. The first one is on-premises ADDS authentication, which is what is being used in our question. On-premise ADDS joined or Microsoft Entra Domain Services joined Windows machines can access Azure file shares with on-premise Active Directory credentials that are synced to Microsoft Entra ID over SMB. Your client must have unimpeded network connectivity to your ADDS. If you already have ADDS set up on premises or on a VM in Azure where your devices are domain joined to your AD, you should use ADDS for Azure file shares authentication. Now the next one is Microsoft Entra Domain Services authentication. Cloud-based Microsoft Entra Domain Services joined Windows VMs can access Azure file shares with Microsoft Entra credentials. In this solution, Microsoft Entra ID runs a traditional Windows Server AD domain on behalf of the customer, which is a child of the customer's Microsoft Entra tenant. And the third one is Microsoft Entra Kerberos for hybrid identities. Using Microsoft Entra ID for authenticating hybrid user identities allows Microsoft Entra users to access Azure file shares using Kerberos authentication. This means your end users can access Azure file shares over the internet without requiring network connectivity to domain controllers from Microsoft Entra Hybrid Joined and Microsoft Entra Joined VMs. Cloud-only identities are not currently supported. So folks, you should know the difference between cloud-only identities and hybrid identities as well. Cloud-only identities are the identities or the users that are created in the cloud, which is Azure AD, or you can say the new name is Entra ID. And hybrid identities are basically the identities that have been created in the on-premise Active Directory and were synced to Azure AD. And the fourth authentication is AD Kerberos authentication for Linux clients. Linux clients can use Kerberos authentication over SMB for Azure files using on-premise ADDS or Microsoft Entra domain services. Now let's read through the restrictions section, as this is critical for answering the questions that you will just see. None of the authentication methods support assigning share level permissions to computer accounts using Azure RBAC. Because computer accounts cannot be synced to an identity in Microsoft Entra ID, if you want to allow a computer account to access Azure file shares using identity-based authentication, use a default share level permission or consider using a service logon account instead. Identity-based authentication is not supported with network file system shares, which is NFS shares. So for each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. And the first statement is you can assign the storage file data SMB share contributor role to user 1 for share 1. Now, since user 1 is a hybrid identity synced from on-premise ADDS for which RBAC roles can be assigned, this statement is correct. Now let's look at next statement. You can assign the storage file data SMB share reader role to computer 1 for share 1. You would already know computer accounts do not have an identity in Microsoft Entra ID, so you cannot configure Azure role RBAC roles for them. This statement is incorrect. The third statement is you can assign the storage file data SMB share elevated contributor role to user 2 for share 1. User 2 is a cloud-only identity, so you cannot use it for permission assignment, making this statement as incorrect. Next question. You have a Microsoft Entra tenant named contoso.com. You have a CSV file that contains the names and email address of 500 external users. You need to create a guest user account in contoso.com for each of the 500 external users. The solution you present is from Entra ID in the Azure portal. You use the bulk invite users operation. Does that meet the goal? You need to tell whether this is correct or not. And folks, this will not meet the goal. Let's head to MS documentation to understand the requirements for bulk invite users operation, which led to marking this as the incorrect solution. So if you use Microsoft Entra B2B collaboration to work with external partners, you can invite multiple guest users to your organization at the same time. In this tutorial, you learn how to use the Microsoft Entra Admin Center to send bulk invitations to external users. Specifically, you will follow these steps. Use bulk invite users to prepare a comma-separated value file with the user information and invitation preferences. Upload the CSV file to Microsoft Entra ID. Verify the users were added to the directory. Now let's head to one of the critical statements. As you can see, you sign in into the Microsoft Entra Admin Center as at least a user administrator. Browse to identity and then click on all users, perform a bulk operations and do a bulk invite. Now on the bulk invite users page, select download to get a valid CSV template with the invitation properties. This is the critical thing which has led to ensuring that the statement or the solution that was provided was not correct. Now open the CSV template and add a line for each guest user. Required values are email address to invite the user who will receive an invitation. And the second critical or important value, required value, is redirection URL. The URL to which the invited user is forwarded after accepting the invitation. If you want to forward the user to the My Apps page, you must change this value to the given value. Then you save the file and do the bulk invite. So folks, in our question, basically the CSV file that was created had name and email address. Even though email address is the mandatory field which was there, but the second mandatory field, which is redirection URL, was not there in the CSV file. So the solution will not meet the goal. You won't be able to invite them using the CSV file in its current format. Question number 189. You have an Azure subscription named subscription 1 that contains a virtual network VNet 1. You add the users in the following table. You have 3 users with the name of user 1, user 2, and user 3. User 1 has owner role, user 2 has security admin role, user 3 has network contributor role. Which user can perform each configuration? To answer, select the appropriate options below. And the first operation or the configuration is add a subnet to VNet 1. And then in the options, you have a combination of different users. So friends, user 1 has owner role, which lets you manage everything, including access to resources. Therefore, user 1 should be able to add a subnet to VNet 1. User 2 has security admin role, which lets it to view security policies, view security states, edit security policies, view alerts and recommendations, dismiss alerts and recommendations. Therefore, user 2 won't be able to add a subnet to VNet 1. And user 3 has network contributor role, which lets it manage networks, including creating subnets. So the correct answer here is option 3. User 1 and user 3 will be able to add a subnet to VNet 1. Let's look at next configuration. Assign a user the reader role to VNet 1. Again, in the options, you have a combination of different users, and based on the explanation of roles, you would already know by now that only user 1 can assign a user the reader role to VNet 1, making it the correct choice. Friends, I hope you have now understood why the options have been chosen as the correct one in this case, but if you still have any doubts, please post them in the comments section. Let's look at question number 190 of the series. You have an Azure subscription that contains the following users in a Microsoft Entra tenant named contoso.onmicrosoft.com. Basically, you have 4 users with the name of user 1, user 2, user 3, and user 4. User 1 and user 2 have global administrator role at Entra ID scope. User 3 has user administrator role at Entra ID scope. And user 4 has owner role at subscription scope. Now, user 1 creates a new Entra tenant named external.contoso.onmicrosoft.com. You need to create new user accounts in external.contoso.onmicrosoft.com. The solution is you instruct user 2 to create the user accounts. Does that meet the goal? You need to choose between yes or no. And friends, this does not meet the goal. User 2 won't be able to create users in external.contoso.onmicrosoft.com. You would notice that user 2 is global administrator for tenant contoso.onmicrosoft.com, and the new tenant was created by user 1, who will be the owner of new tenant. User 2 will not get any role unless exclusively given by user 1. Therefore, this solution will not meet the required goal. So folks, there can be multiple variations of this question. For example, if this question was talking about you instruct user one to create the user account, then it would have been yes, because user one is going to be the owner of the new tenant as it is the one who created it. Or there would have been a different variation of this question. You add user 2 as a user administrator for the new tenant and instruct it to add user account. In that case, also the solution would have been met. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video, folks. If you haven't looked at other parts of the series yet, then explore them as well to get the maximum benefit from our content. Link to the playlist is available in the description section of this video. Stay tuned for more parts in our Azure Administrator Exam Practice Question series.